Hello everyone, in this video today we're going to be going through the topic of short-term obligations expected to be refinanced. Okay, so basically what is a short-term obligation? Well, it is a liability that will require the use of current assets or the creation of other current liabilities within the next year or operating cycle, whichever is longer. Just a definition, right? It just means short-term obligation is something we're going to use current assets, right? We might use up cash to pay for these things, or we might have to make another current liability to satisfy the liability that's coming due, okay, within the next year or operating cycle, okay? These liabilities are coming due, and we're gonna have to either make a cash payment or something like that, or we're gonna have to make another current liability, okay, to satisfy the liability that is coming due. So sometimes companies refinance short-term obligations on a long-term basis. If a company refinances the short-term obligation on a long-term basis, the obligation should be classified as long-term, right? Because that kind of makes sense, right? Because if we refinance the short-term obligation on a long-term basis, that means that that new obligation is a long-term obligation. So we should classify it as long-term, okay? Now, a company must exclude short-term obligations from current liabilities if both of the following criteria are met, okay? First, the company intends to refinance the obligation on a long-term basis. And then second, the company demonstrates an ability to consummate the refinancing. To prove this ability to consummate, the company must do one of the following. It must actually refinance the short-term liability by issuing equity securities or long-term debt, or enter into a financing agreement that allows the company to refinance the debt. Okay, so basically, if a company meets these criteria of intending to refinance and then demonstrating an ability to consummate the refinancing, those current liabilities they were previously current liabilities, but now they're going to be refinanced on a long-term basis, those are going to be excluded from current liabilities, and they're going to be shown up in long-term liabilities, okay? So if a company refinances the short-term obligation, the amount of the short-term obligation that is excluded from current liabilities may not exceed the proceeds of the new long-term obligation, okay? So as an example, if a company has $2,000 in short-term obligation due next year and issues $1,500 of long-term debt, only $1,500 may be excluded from current liabilities, okay? So just to mean that if they refinance it, the amount of the short-term obligation that is excluded from current liability may not exceed the proceeds, okay? The proceeds in this case are $1,500 of the new long-term debt, okay? So the amount that we exclude from current liabilities can't exceed the amount that we issue, right? That doesn't make sense because we're only going to be able to make $1,500 of this long term, so that means only $1,500 can be excluded from current liabilities. The other $500 would have to be shown in current liabilities in this specific example, okay? So that's a relatively basic example, and we just went through kind of conceptually what the topic is. Let's go through a couple of relatively quick problems. These aren't too bad. There's just a couple variations of them. We have a few variations here, and as long as you know the few variations and kind of the definitions and the criteria for what goes in short term, what goes in long term, it's not too terrible. So anyways, our first example, as of December 31 of 2017, XYZ has $1 million of notes payable due on January 31st of 2018. So that's obviously within the next year, right? It's like a month away. On January 20th of 2018, so this would be before the notes are due, the company issues $600,000 of common stock. Then on January 31st of 2018, the company uses $600,000 from the issuance of the stock, along with $400,000 of additional cash to extinguish the notes payable. That would be the $1 million of notes payable. Determine how much of these notes payable should be classified as current and how much should be classified as long-term debt. So again, remember, we have this rule that we cannot exclude from current liabilities more than the amount that we issue. Okay, so we issue $600,000 of common stock. Okay, so we should be thinking, okay, well, we can exclude from current liabilities a maximum of $600,000, right? The other thing we want to keep in mind is the dates, okay? The dates are very important, okay? So in this case, the new obligation, or not necessarily obligation in this case because it's common stock, but the new type of financing, the refinancing occurs before the notes payable is paid off, before it becomes due. It's paid off on January 1st when it becomes due, right? So because of the fact that we receive this money before we pay off the note, we're allowed to exclude $600,000 from current liabilities. Okay, so long-term debt will be $600,000 because it meets the definition to reclassify, right? We intended to refinance and we actually did refinance, right? But they also use $400,000 of just straight up cash that's just laying around to satisfy the current liability. That has to be a current liability because they're using cash, right? And we look at the definition of a short-term obligation, it's a liability that requires the use of assets, current assets, right? We're using up current assets to satisfy this liability. So it must be a current liability, okay? And again, the date is very important, which we'll see in this next example, okay? So again, remember, we have to be worried about the amount that's issued, and then we also have to be worried about if we're using extra cash that's just sitting around on the books or in our, bank account, then that is going to always be a current liability, okay? So then we have the second example where, again, they have the same notes payable due on the same date and it's the same amount. However, now on February 1st, the date changes from February 1st to from January 20th to February 1st. Okay, so this is now after the date the note payable is due. The company issues $600,000 of common stock. Additionally, on January 1st, 31st, the company pays out the note payable using $1 million of cash. Again, determine how much goes in current, determine how much goes in long term. Here, we cannot exclude any from current liabilities because if we read the facts, it says they're using $100,000, $1 million of cash. Okay, none of that comes from the issuance of the common stock. The issuance of the common stock occurs the next day, right? So when we actually pay off the note itself, there is no money from the common stock that's received by the company. Okay, so that means the current liabilities are $1 million because we're using cash. So it meets the definition of current liability. The long-term debt is zero because it does not meet the definition to classify because it is issued after the due date of the debt. The common stock is issued after the due date of the debt. So we have to be careful, okay? If we're given a problem and the date comes after the due date when we actually pay off the debt, okay, in that case, that obligation has to be completely under the current liability section because we're just straight up using cash, right? This issuance of this common stock, it kind of doesn't matter at that point because there's nothing to refinance at that point, right? And so that's just a couple of things to be worried about. The first thing is the amounts, right? How much can we potentially exclude from current liabilities, but then also the dates, okay? And again, we also want to keep in mind our criteria, okay? And what's the definition of a short-term obligation, right? And so that's basically the end of this section, and I hope that was helpful.